measures that are available in the data set. Also, I'll say I always love this part of the country at this time of the year. It's great to be down here. Always really fun to be down here. My brother just moved down here about a year ago. Honored to be part of the conference. So thank you for inviting me, Jim. And it's also nice to see old friends, Rhea, Jim, etc. And what I'll do is I'll just give you some insight into the data set and give you a sense of what's available in it and how we motivated it, the theoretical foundations, and what you can do with it. And so we'll just get into that. So over the last 2 decades, much of my work has focused on the relationship between social network connectedness and health and aging. Later life, I think, is one of the most interesting times to delve into looking at social networks because networks change a lot during that time. There's loss, there are all kinds of problems with having to adapt to loss and trying to replace social network ties. And so you actually get to see some really interesting dynamics relating to things like network turnover and replacement that you don't often see in other parts of life. And I never really wanted to be a social gerontologist, but I've actually found it to be an interesting area to work in. So I'll try to walk you through some of the data that are available that we've created for this. And I'll start by talking about our primary motivation behind studying over life change. And as many of you know, there's been a lot of interest in the extent to which older adults maintain social ties over time. Engagement in the community, there's a lot of work on that. Think about Robert Putnam and things like that. And one reason why this is so important to study is that being socially connected is so crucially important for health. And this is, I believe, one of the main reasons we're here today is to talk about health and things like cognition. And there are a large number of connections between social networks, social network change, which is a newer topic, and health. And I'll try to get into a little bit about how you can study that using the NSHAP data and how I have studied that over the last few years. And like I said, there's been a shift over the last few years in talking not just about the extent to which people are social connected, but also the extent to which their social networks change and how the changes in those social networks can relate to changes in their health, because we've begun to learn that the changes in their health have independent connections and sometimes connections that amplify or deflect the kinds of health effects that happen, trajectories of change and trajectories of health. So we need to know, this is one of the things that we decided to do when we built the NSHAP data set, is we decided early on, 2005, well actually we decided in 2003, before we collected the data in 2005, how to begin to measure that change. And we began to sort of set the stage for understanding changes in health, egocentric changes in network connectedness and health. And we knew that we needed to understand not just that, but also a variety of different health outcomes. So I'll walk through some of that a little bit here. Okay, So I've been working on the project for over 20 years now, since I was a graduate student at University of Chicago, and after learning networks from Jim, who actually taught me networks in SAS. And then at Chicago, I had to learn it in Stata. But I did not learn R, so I'm kind of like behind the times in that a little bit. But anyway, this is a collaborative project with a large number of people, including scholars in psychology, medical doctors, policy workers, and sociologists, and so on. The project is actually led by Linda Waite, and I'm one of a team of an army of a platoon of scholars sort of working on this project. Over the years, it's gotten, I think, about $60 million or something like that. And I'll talk to you a little bit about why all of that money was necessary and why it's been necessary. And it's still being funded, still being run. So, question, to what extent, how do older adults' social connections change over long periods of time? This is something that I'll talk about later in an empirical way. But in the meantime, what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about the actual data collection. Theoretical background, when we're thinking about social network change, there are a number of different theoretical orientations that we can adopt. One is social disengagement theory. Now this is probably the one theory that people have abandoned the most over the years. And this is the idea that older adults kind of age out and disappear from society. It's an old structural functionalist version of aging. That is, people see themselves as no longer being relevant. And so they just kind of like move on. That has been debunked quite a bit. Socio-emotional selectivity theory is actually not that different. This is the theory that older adults move on and see later life as a time when they just want to focus on the people who are closest to them. And so they begin to shed their weak ties. They are less likely to be bridges, and they are more likely to just be connected to people within their households and their close family members. There's a little bit of support for that, but again, I see it as very close to social disengagement theory. Continuity theory is more interesting. This is the theory that people actually try to maintain the kinds of patterns of relationships that they've had over their lives, the types of connections they've had over their lives, and that when they lose somebody, they adapt and they compensate. That is, say somebody becomes widowed, or they lose a close friend or something like that, they'll find a way to remain connected. That's often done via local organizations, religious organizations, book clubs, things like that, neighbors. And life course theory, of course, is important because it points to some of the things that actually lead to the loss and sort of propels people into this adaptation process. So there are a number of really interesting theoretical aspects to this, why we've begun to think about the not just the number of connections that people have, the types of connections people have, but also how their networks change, why they change, and how network turnover happens. This gets very soon to the issue of health. Yes. So this is an example of an older woman from our data. She was, I believe, 70 when we started interviewing her. And you can see her egocentric network. I'll talk to you a little bit about the egocentric network data, how they were collected. She's here, and you can see that she's surrounded by family. And then 5 years later, in 2010, you can see how her network has changed. Her husband died, and she's begun to surround herself now by friends, and they're weaker ties. And the tie strength is measured in terms of frequency of contact, basically. So at the beginning, very strong ties, very interconnected network, very dense, and then later on, the network, the egocentric network weakens a little bit, but she's maintaining connections, and she's exchanged different types of social ties for what she had before. So there are several rounds of data in the NSHAP data set, and this has been structured so that we're focusing on older adults starting in 2005, okay? With people between the ages of 57 and 85 years old. These are basically baby boomers. And the idea was to go back and visit them every 5 years, which is what we thought would be a good amount of time to study both changes in their networks and changes in their health. And also, you know, there are money concerns. We couldn't do it every year. There's just no way. I mean, we had to send interviewers out on planes and things like that, you know. So, and that turned out to be very fruitful. And we've gone back every 5 years since then. So 2005, 2010, 2015. We did a small, this is a really interesting one, a small data collection experiment during COVID because we couldn't talk to them in person in 2020. But we did a mail out sort of thing and questionnaire on the phone. So we have data from them during the pandemic, and now we have a new data set coming out for 2023, I think. Wide range of topics. Round one, good response rates, 76% round one, 89% of return people round two, and round three, a good number of follow-ups. I haven't looked at what's happening with round four yet, but I think it's probably pretty much the same. But what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to replenish the data. Just talk a little bit about, first I'll talk about the content, and then I'll talk about how the data collection unfolded. So a number of topics here. We've got the social network data. These are classic GSS-based confidant data. With whom do you discuss important matters, that kind of thing. We have religious connections to religious community, local community, neighbors, household context, neighborhood context. Now, this is something that I think is really interesting, is we merged in data from the census to get to that. We got special special sub-award for that part. Cognition is a really interesting one. We have the MoCA for that, which is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Sensory function is really interesting because here we have things like taste strips and smell things. Interesting thing about that is that taste and smell are the best predictors of cognitive decline long term. And so we have some really good data on that. And I remember doing these when we got them in 2004, I think, is when they were shipped in, and trying them. And it was really, really interesting. Like, what do you smell? There are like five things. Do you smell something nasty? Do you smell something good? You know, fruit or what? And those are really good indicators. Mental health, personality related to cognition, physical health, biomeasures are fascinating. And the biomeasures involve a variety of, the interviewers were trained for weeks before we sent them out into the field. They had like a big piece of luggage that they lugged along with them as they were walking into the respondents' homes. And they had in that suitcase, this big wheelie suitcase, they had tape measures, they had the smell sticks and all that stuff, and they also had a measure for weight, and we did blood spots. That was an interesting meeting when we all had to do that like a year before we fielded this. We actually sat in there and pricked our fingers and put blood on these blood spot things, and then learned how the interviewers were going to pack them up and send them out. And then once this is done, they send them off to labs to get assayed. And they get all kinds of stuff like C-reactive protein, and they learn about diseases that are present in the body and things like that. They did vaginal swabs for the women, and they actually had to teach the interviewers, the female interviewers, how to teach the women to take those, because that teaches you about bacterial vaginosis and all kinds of little things like that, which are oncogenic. And we did saliva, passive drool tests too, which gives you also other disease indicators. So there's a lot there. And we also did very detailed sex partnership background. This is all down to Ed Lauman wanting to learn about people's sexual experiences, and perceived discrimination. So again, wide range of topics there. There are a number of special issue journals in the journals of gerontology. They've been actually very useful over the years, very generous to us and allowing us to every now and then basically buy a special issue. And so, for example, I'll write a special issue paper on social network collection I did it for year 1, year 2, year 3, and I'm working on one for year 4. The one I'm working on for year 4 is more about cognitive decline and how that affects missingness in network data, which I think is really interesting. And every one of these special issues has some kind of information about how the data were collected, response rates, sample design, Also, there's always one on psychology. There's always one on other these, social issues, partnership histories, things like that. The health measures as well. So the timeline. So we did round 1, 2005, round 2, 2010, 2015. We did this COVID study, and round 4 is the data should be coming through pretty soon on that. And in round 1 we got over 3,000 interviews, and then we, in subsequent waves, we went back to all of those people, and we also tried to supplement the data with new recruits, and also started recruiting those respondents' partners so that we could get partnership data, which I think is really interesting. Round 3, and by the way, I can, these slides will be available if you want them, so you can understand how this was done. The COVID study was remote data collection. And then in round 4, we returned to everyone that we could who had been recruited before. The questionnaire, all told, the questionnaire and the biomeasure data collection taken together took about 90 minutes to 2 hours in most cases. We try to tell them it's going to be 90 minutes, but we kind of push it a little bit, I think, most cases. And then also, because there's some other things we want to collect, we do a leave behind paper and pencil questionnaire to get additional information about things like some social connections, like to what extent are you friends with neighbors, and other things that we didn't feel like we had time to ask about in the home. We also do actigraphy. That's basically getting people up, testing how quickly they can move around and things like that. And sleep, and proxy interviews for people who were cognitively inclined, who had been cognitively impaired. That we've obviously noted who had to do that. This gives you a sense of the topics that were covered in the different rounds. Round 1, round 2, round 3, the COVID study, and round 4. And you can see the biomeasures. We do have some genetic data, accelerometry, cardiovascular function, things like pulse, the blood spots, the passive drool, and all the data that come from those things. We did SPMSQ in wave 1, but then we did MOCA in the subsequent waves. And the neighborhood context data are, like I said, merged in largely from the census. Also, we had interviewers write down things that they saw in the neighborhood. And the household data are largely from the interviewers as well. So that was kind of cheap. Those were cheap data points. Social connectedness data are, like I said, the interviews with people based on largely GSS-based type confidant discussion network type questionnaire, up to 5 people, like the GSS. We also made sure that if they hadn't named a spouse or partner, we followed up and asked, do you have a spouse or partner? And then we asked, is there any other special person that you want to name? So up to 7 people for, yep.
Question, are you still able to follow the participants that get institutionalized or into some type of facility?
We don't do interviews with institutionalized individuals, but we can do proxy. Yeah, We do proxy data with their partners, usually, if they're available, or children. And we have very good information. Like, you know, this is run by NORC, National Organization of Research at Chicago, and they're pretty good at like sort of recording who's available and where they are and that kind of thing. So they do try to keep very close follow-up data. So the pandemics, the COVID study part, I thought was really interesting, and they did as I said, a remote study, and we did mail push, tried to get people to respond to that, and we also sent them. And I'll just kind of skip through this a little bit in the interest of time. We sent them what we call a bio box that they could kind of do on their own sort of at home without an interviewer present. And that included information about how to store the biosamples, how to mail them, how to collect them. Here's your bio booklet. And then a supply box, which contained all of the things they needed to collect the biomeasures, like the pricks and things like that, the saliva, passive drool collection and things like that. So we have all of that information for that time period, which I think is fascinating. I haven't actually gotten into that myself that much. But that's what it looked like when we sent it to them. The actual biomeasure collection that the interviewers did in home, that they do in home, like I said, is a big wheelie suitcase, a lot bigger than this. But we still got some good stuff with this. And so this gives you just a little more information. This gives you the total number of respondents for each of the rounds. We've decided to change. We're not calling them waves anymore. We call them rounds. Largely because we're recruiting new people sometimes at each time point. And you can see cohort 1, wave 1, cohort 1, wave 2, and then the number of people who are added at each point. So a good number of respondents available. I'll just walk very quickly through. Yeah, so this gives you another, just like a more specific sense of the things that we measured. It's just a more detailed portrait. Social context includes the network roster, social support, participation, caregiving, receiving. There's an elder mistreatment module, which I think is really interesting. Partnership and marital histories, sexual histories, cognition, the mental health measures, all of these different, we also have a full list of pharmaceutical background for everybody. They literally went to the medicine cabinets and recorded all their medications. Anthropometrics, all that stuff. Yep. And then the COVID experiences were asking about concerns about COVID, whether whether they knew anyone who died from COVID, and whether they had to delay care because of it, and work and financial impacts of their COVID experience. And it just kind of lays out when these data are available, for which years, which rounds. Okay, so I'll just go quickly, just in the interest of time, because I'm going to keep this shorter. Go quickly through the kinds of data that we have on social networks. Talk a little bit about one of the studies I've done on trends in social network change based on what we've seen here in this age group. You know, like I said, we have data on the social network structure, number of ties, with whom they're connected, frequency of contact with them. We do a little bit of Brea talks about as functional specificity, to what extent do they talk about health with these people, and their connections with each other. So we get network density from that. Social community connectedness is largely based on their ties to, we get religious connectedness, neighborhood connectedness, whether they're connected in other neighborhood groups, local community groups, those kind of frequency of volunteering, those kinds of things. And we also get network turnover, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But first, I just want to go through some of the general descriptions of the data for the first 3 rounds of data collection, not including the last wave or the COVID wave. And you can see something that I point out in some of my recent work, that these numbers are fairly consistent across waves. Now remember, most of these people were about 60, 70, 80 years old when we started. I'm only using the baseline respondents for this. They were pretty old when we started contacting them. Their networks look pretty much the same over the waves. And we refer to this as homeostasis. And this is something that has been discussed in social gerontology for a long time. It's a term that's borrowed from the natural sciences, but the idea is that basically people want to maintain the social environments that they've experienced and learned and loved over their lives. And it's not just about them doing it. It's not just agency. It's also about opportunity structure and what some of the structural functionalists referred to as sort of the environmental effects on people's social lives. That is that, you know, to some extent it's enforced, or it's something that's available to you, that you can maintain it because you live in a certain kind of environment. All those things are kind of coming together here to keep networks the same, these network structural features the same over time in these people's lives. And this is, you know, like I said, this is, you know, you're talking about people who turned from 60 to 70 or 70 to 80 over this period of time. So those numbers remain pretty stable. Another thing I wanted to point out here is that you're just as likely to have sort of an increase in some kind of network size measure as you are to have a decrease in a network size measure, and there's a lot of stability over time as well. And again, that's something I can we'll make available to everybody on the slides. So this is more of a sequential story. So we have people who experience a wave 1 to wave 2 decrease in networks. And then what happened in between wave 2 and wave 3? increases. That is, people who lost people between waves 1 and 2 experienced increases in these various important network measures between waves 2 and 3, which means that they're adapting. It means that they're bouncing back to some extent. Like, look at that. Confident network size increase 63% versus decrease 16%. Frequency of contact with confidants, 58% versus 25%. Composition increases. This is probably family members coming around, helping. And network density increases, which means, less bridging potential, but it also means more social support, coordination. So think about that. And more religious services attendance, which suggests that when people lose people, then they go to church more often. And same with volunteering, same with organized group involvement. Adaptation at work. Yeah, just pointing out the modal patterns here. Increase rather than decrease.
Sorry, can you talk a little bit more about network science? Is that like having a trends over time?
It's a confidant network measure. So it's largely about whom they're reporting. And I'll get to network change here in a moment. And I think just in the interest of time, I'll skip over a little bit of this stuff. And these are patterns that you see among people who experienced increases. And again, people who experienced increases sort of tamp down the networks, and then you get that homeostasis thing happening again, where they're trying to maintain the pattern of connections that they had before. Interesting. This is how we measured some of this stuff. Now, remember, and this was brought up earlier, you can't just measure change in size, because change in size just gives you a sense of, you don't know where it comes from. You don't know whether it's the same people. You don't know whether they're just going back to the same people, or whether they're actually replacing network members. And the network replacement question is actually really interesting. And so we made a point, and we do this at every round. I call them, they're still labeled as waves, but we call them rounds now. At every point to match the network members between rounds. So we gathered just enough information about the alters at each round to be able to track them again the next round, 5 years later. Like, did you name Rob last time 5 years ago? And they'll say, yeah, that's the same Rob. And so the interviewer will match it. And so this is a good example of the roster matching process that we undertook between waves. And like I said, we've done this over multiple waves. And so this way, you get a sense of whether the network size change, so you can have a network that's the same size in two waves, but it's different people. And so it's important to know whether they're actually doing some turnover. And that gives you a sense of the sort of continuity adaptation process. And that's what we're trying to capture here. I created this Venn diagram using Stata, using this sort of pven2 program. And this shows the overlap, typical overlap among the entire sample for the baseline respondents across the three waves. And you can see this really interesting pattern where there's actually a lot of overlap among the three waves, but it does change. And so there's turnover. There's quite a bit of turnover. The Venn diagrams don't completely overlap with each other, but there is some overlap there that's worth looking at. And the extent to which this changes is, I think, a really important question for looking at things like health outcomes. So think about, for example, somebody who moves from a group of people in wave 1 and then has a completely different set of people at wave 3. And what kind of impacts does that have on their health? It creates sort of, to go back to classical sociology, it creates a sort of anomie in a way. That is a sense of instability in the social network, and the sense that there's difficult to coordinate support when you're getting all kinds of different people in your network every few years, and they're not all friends with each other, and your husband's died or something like that. And then you end up with a completely different network at wave 3, 10 years later. And what does that do to your health? To me, it suggests instability, unpredictability in everyday life, probably depression, anxiety, at least, stress, for sure. And so that this sort of these patterns of change have very important outcomes for health and well-being. And just in the interest of time, I'll move forward very quickly here. This is a map of just the first, between 10 years, the first wave and the third wave of data collection. And you can look at, we looked specifically at how many people they added, how many people they lost, how many people they gained, how many people were the same. And this is equal to notice that the highest bars here, the gray bars, are equal turnover rates. This is homeostasis in action. This is people maintaining their networks, the network size that they're used to. The most surprising part of this for me is that the green bars, which are net additions to the network, are higher than the net loss bars, which means that it's actually more likely in later life that people are adding network ties than losing them. And it goes, I think it goes against common stereotypes about older adults. It's a really fascinating thing. They published this in, I think it was Journals of Gerontology a few years ago. But it is a really interesting finding for me. So main conclusions. I don't believe in disengagement theory or selectivity theory. with respect to confidant networks at least, which granted are strong ties. I think that those things are rare, more likely to see growth than decline, and also homeostasis is more normal than decline for sure, and growth is probably more normal than decline. People maintain pre-existing levels of social connectedness. Network losses are offset by network gains, and changes in one direction tend to be offset by changes in the other direction. That's why I don't use the term continuity ontology a lot. I don't think people continue to maintain their ties. I think they adapt. And that's a very different way of thinking about things. And also, I think the social environment plays a very important role in this. It's to some extent an environmental structural functionalist thing that happens that gives people opportunity structures, as Merton used to talk about. And there are also obviously limitations to this. Don't have data on non-confidant ties really. I mean, we have some community connectedness stuff here, but it would be nice to have information on things like social media ties. I think that's increasingly relevant today. Non-institutionalized older Americans, not looking at other countries. We have some data on household and neighborhood stuff, but not a lot. It's better than most, I think, data sets in that extent. And of course, there's the issue of selection. We're looking at survivors here. So we're looking at people who have made it through those older years, and we don't have a really good sense of the role of networks in mortality, although I've done a little bit of work on that, a little bit of playing around with those data. Key takeaways: older adults tend to remain socially connected. Homeostasis, and definitely a need for more research. Also, I want to acknowledge the NSHAP respondents. They got their fingers pricked. They had to do all kinds of anthropometrics, measurements. They were measured. People actually took, measures around their stomachs, things like that. Supported by NIH, especially NIA. Linda Waits, the principal investigator. You can see the other investigators' name there. And also NRRC, who actually runs the study. And also the data are publicly available. So go through ICPSR and NACDA, and you can get the data from there. Some of the data are sensitive, but you can get most of the other data pretty quickly. Thank you. And I guess I'll send you all off to lunch. Yeah, any questions? Yeah.
Hi, this is great. Thanks so much. This is kind of a side question, but I was curious, since you were going into people's homes.
Yeah.
This is a patient population that tends to be, have comorbidities, be sicker. Were there situations where the staff who went in were worried about like the well-being or welfare?
Yeah. There.
Just for like home visit type studies, like what kind of assistance did you have?
Well, NORC had pretty good protocols for dealing with, they trained the interviewers in how to deal with these situations. Like, so for example, if there was evidence of severe cognitive decline, they would often just kind of shy away from the interview. And if there was a severe physical problem, if the person wanted to do it, they would do it. So they would do the interview if there was, even if there was a severe physical problem, as long as the person could respond to the questions in a cogent way. There were situations where people would, kind of sad situations where a couple people like wanted the interview as a connection, you know, and even though they were like, you know, just severely, they were like sort of about to, Ed would say, drop off the twig. Even if they were about to go out, they would want to do it sometimes because they actually liked that. And the interesting thing is, they liked talking about their social networks more than just about anything. They really did enjoy talking about the people they were connected to, and it kind of gave them a sense of their connectedness. And yeah, I love, you know, there's Bob and there's Mary and, you know, whatever. And it gave them kind of like a sort of light, you know. And yeah, we did interview people like that. Yeah, there were some difficult interviews, and I have a paper I'm working on about that, but it worked out pretty well, actually. They really enjoyed it. Like I said, we got a good response rate. So, yeah. I think we're done, right? One more? I can take one more, yeah.
Can you make an effort of understanding what were the predictive factors of membership in the green group of addition versus the red group of subtraction?
Say again the first part.
Just like what were the predictive factors for losing or
For turnover, yeah. That's a good question. The main predictors that I've looked at have to do with social disadvantage. That is that people who were either materially or socially disadvantaged, people with low SES or racial minorities, were more likely to be unable to replace network losses. And that probably, again, has to do with their social environments. So social turnover is heavily patterned by social disadvantage. And you often find that people who are socially disadvantaged and materially disadvantaged are less able to replace, like, say, when they have a widowhood experience or something. And there are reasons for that, or a number of reasons for that. More residential turnover, less availability of transportation, more criminal neighborhoods. There are just so many ways, and also they're also more likely to be physically unhealthy, and so you see less effective turnover in those groups. I have a paper on that if you're interested, email me.